floor of the Grand Mall bit into the palms of my hands, cold and unforgiving. I didn't look up as the crowd's laughter rippled through the air like a physical blow. Above me, the weight of a 4-inch designer heel pressed into the center of my hand, pinning me to the puddle of spilled champagne. "Clean it up, beggar," a voice spat, high, sharp, and dripping with a cruel delight. "The scent of wet dog follows you like a shadow. You're polluting the king's air." I didn't move. My fingers were numb, but I could feel the grit of the broken glass beneath my skin. Then, the laughter stopped. It didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a vacuum. Rhythmic, heavy paws thudded against the stone. Click, click, click. The sound of a chain leash rattling echoed through the hall. A low, guttural vibration started in the air, a growl that vibrated in my very bones. The heel lifted from my hand as the girl above me gasped, her breath catching in a wheeze of terror. I looked up. 6 feet of pure, lethal shadow stood over me. The Alpha, a beast with eyes like molten amber and a coat as black as a funeral shroud, was inches from my throat. His jaws opened, showing rows of white, bone-crushing teeth. The crowd drew a collective breath, waiting for the sound of tearing flesh. Behind the dog, a man stood, his silhouette framed by the bright, well-lit atrium. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air around him felt like a localized storm. The Alpha lunged. I braced for the impact, my eyes squeezing shut. But instead of teeth, I felt the rough, warm sand of a tongue against my scarred palm. The beast dropped to his belly, his massive head sliding into my lap with a whimper that broke the silence. The man in the suit froze. His grip on the leather leash went slack, falling to the floor with a heavy thud. He stepped forward, the light hitting his face for the first time, eyes narrow, calculating, and suddenly filled with a shock that bordered on pain. He stared at the dog, then at the girl in the rags. "Fenris?" His voice was a low rasp. He reached out, his hand hovering over the dog's leg, tracing the faint professional stitchwork that I had performed in a damp cave 3 months ago. His gaze snapped to mine, and the world seemed to tilt. "You," he whispered, his voice a blade of ice. "You're the one who took him." He reached down, his fingers catching my chin and forcing me to look into his eyes, but before he could speak, the glass ceiling of the mall shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. The glass ceiling didn't just break, it detonated. Shards of crystal rained down like jagged, transparent petals, reflecting the bright, well-lit atrium's lights into 1,000 blinding needles. Before a single diamond point could graze my skin, a heavy weight slammed into me. The Korean Mafia King didn't hesitate. His wool coat, smelling of expensive tobacco and cold rain, draped over me as he pinned me to the marble, his body acting as a human shield. "Down! Stay down!" His voice rasped against my ear, a low, guttural command that overrode the screaming of the socialites. Beside us, Fenris, the massive Doberman I had saved, didn't flee. He stood over my legs, his fur bristling, a low vibration in his chest that I felt through the floor. He wasn't growling at the chaos, he was guarding me. Black-clad men with suppressed weapons swarmed from the mall exits, their movements professional and silent. This wasn't a robbery, it was a targeted execution. The king pulled me up by my bicep, his grip firm but careful not to crush. He didn't look at the gunman, he looked at the dog. Fenris, who usually tore the throat out of anyone who stepped within 5 feet of the king, was pressing his flank against my hip, his head low, shielding my vitals. "To the car, now!" the king barked. We moved in a blur of cinematic motion, shadows and light dancing across 8K hyper-realistic textures of marble and blood. We burst through the rear service entrance into the freezing night. A fleet of black SUVs sat idling, their exhausts huffing white plumes into the air. The king shoved me into the back of the lead vehicle, Fenris leaping in after me without a command, his heavy weight settling across my feet. The door slammed, sealing us in a tomb of leather and silence. As the SUV surged forward, the interior lights flickered on. The king sat across from me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, controlled breaths. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the dog's rear leg. He reached out, his long fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as he parted the fur on Fenris's haunch. There, stark against the black skin, was the faint, jagged line of the scar. It wasn't the messy work of a street vet. The stitches were microscopic, tied with the precision of a master surgeon, the movie-in-the-mind detail of the work I had done in a cave with a stolen needle. "Where did you learn to throw a subcutaneous suture?" The king's voice was a blade of ice, his eyes snapping to mine. My palms were sweating, and my knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the floor mats. I was just a beggarly dog walker to him, a nobody who lived in the cracks of the city. If I told him my father was the man his family had erased, I wouldn't live to see the sunrise. I found him in the woods, I whispered, my voice thin. He was dying. He was trapped in a poacher's steel, the king corrected, his gaze never leaving my face. The wound was lethal. The infection should have stopped his heart in 6 hours. Yet someone spent 3 days in a damp cave, using their own body heat to keep him from going into shock. He leaned closer, the scent of the mall's spilled champagne still clinging to my hair. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small silver medical tag, the one I had dropped the night Fenris disappeared. You didn't just save a dog, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You saved the bloodline of the North. And in my world, mercy like that has a very high price. The SUV suddenly screeched to a halt, the tires screaming against the asphalt. My head snapped toward the window. We weren't at a mansion. We were standing at the gates of the abandoned medical facility where my father had been taken 10 years ago. The king gripped the door handle, his knuckles white. Get out! It's time you see what your mercy actually bought you. The heavy iron doors groaned, a sound like a dying beast echoing through the hollowed-out ribs of the facility. I was shoved inside, my boots skidding on tiles that hadn't seen a mop in a decade. Dust motes danced in the beam of the king's flashlight, thick enough to choke on. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a graveyard of memories, and the air held the faint lingering sting of formaldehyde and old blood. Sit, the king commanded, his voice vibrating against the concrete walls. He didn't point to a chair. He pointed to a rusted surgical table bolted to the center of the room, the same table where my father's career had been dissected and destroyed. My palms were sweating, and my knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the dark stains on the headrest. I sat, the cold metal seeping through my thin jeans like a physical threat. Kenzo stepped into the light, his silk tie loosened, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator's wings. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like the judge of an underworld court. He reached into the pocket of his tailored coat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. My heart missed a beat. That was my father's research. You recognize the stitches on Fenris, Kenzo began, his eyes narrow and calculating. 8K hyper-realistic detail, catching the flecks of gold in his irises. The interrupted vertical mattress technique. It was pioneered by one man, a man who disappeared into the shadows of this city 10 years ago. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning ash-white. I had to stay in the fast lane. Every second I stayed silent was a second closer to him, realizing I was the daughter of the man he was hunting. I told you, I rasped, my voice cracking in the dry air. I learned it from books, from the internet. Liar, he whispered, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. I've had the best street vets and underground surgeons in the country look at this dog. They all said the same thing. This wasn't a repair. It was a masterpiece. Whoever did this had hands trained by a ghost. He slammed the journal onto the table beside me, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The book fell open to a page titled The Alpha Protocol. It was a theory on how to save a canine from poacher-grade neurotoxins, the exact toxin Fenris had been fighting. Beside me, the Alpha let out a low, protective growl, his massive head resting on the edge of the table near my hand. He wasn't looking at Kenzo, he was watching the door. The beast knew something we didn't. My father didn't teach me that, I lied, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I found a man in the slums. He was drunk, dying. He traded me his skills for a bottle of gin. Kenzo's hand moved faster than I could track. He didn't strike me. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to look up into a face that was a mask of cold fury. You have his eyes, Amara. The same defiance, the same misplaced mercy. His thumb traced the scar on my jawline, a memory of the night the facility was burned. The man who reported your father, he didn't just want him gone. He wanted the secret your father hid in the DNA of this dog's pack. And now, you've brought that secret right back to my doorstep. Suddenly, the red light of a silent alarm began to pulse against the walls. Fenris lunged to his feet, his fur bristling like a row of spears. The action first, start of the real nightmare had begun. The king didn't flinch. He reached for his weapon, but he didn't point it at the door. He pointed it at me. The rivals are here because of you, he said, his voice a blade of ice. They don't want the dog. They want the girl who knows how to fix him. Before I could speak, a gas canister smashed through the high window, hissing white smoke into the room. Kenzo's grip on my chin tightened. If we die tonight, Amara, I'm taking your secret to the grave with me. He pulled me off the table, and shoved me behind his back just as the first black-clad operative burst through the iron doors. The first bullet tore through the white haze, sparking off the rusted surgical table an inch from my ear. The screech of metal on metal was the only warning before Kenzo Sato's weight slammed into me again, driving the air from my lungs. We hit the floor behind a concrete support pillar, the impact vibrating through my teeth. "Breathe shallow." Kenzo's voice was a low, jagged rasp against the back of my neck. He didn't have a gas mask. I looked back to see him tearing a strip of silk from his own shirt, wrapping it tight around his nose and mouth. His eyes, usually cold and calculating in the bright mall light, were now bloodshot, tracking movement through the swirling chemical fog with the intensity of a predator. A second volley of suppressed shots chewed into the pillar above us, showering my hair in concrete dust. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone, my fingers digging into the grit on the floor. Click, clack. The sound of a fresh magazine sliding home echoed through the chamber. Beside us, Fenris was a shadow among shadows. The alpha didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stayed low to the ground, his ears pinned back, his body a coiled spring of black muscle. Through the haze, I saw a flicker of movement, a tactical boot stepping over a fallen light fixture. Kenzo didn't reach for his gun. He reached for a glass beaker on the floor, a relic from my father's old lab. He hurled it into the darkness. The sound of shattering glass acted like a starter pistol. The operative fired toward the noise, and in that split second of distraction, Fenris launched. The dog was a streak of ink, a 120-pound weapon of teeth and fury. There was a sickening crunch followed by a wet, gurgling scream that cut off as abruptly as it began. Kenzo grabbed my bicep, hauling me to my feet. "Move, now!" We didn't run. We moved in a tactical crouch, staying low where the gas was thinnest. Every breath was a struggle, my throat feeling like I had swallowed a handful of needles. Kenzo's hand was a vice, guiding me through the maze of overturned gurneys and shattered cabinets. We reached the back service stairwell. Kenzo kicked the door open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. We scrambled up the stairs, the air becoming cooler and clearer as we climbed away from the gas. On the third-floor landing, he shoved me against the wall, his chest heaving as he finally tore the silk mask from his face. "You're not just a dog walker," he wheezed, his eyes boring into mine. "You knew where the blind spots were in this room. You knew the layout of a building that hasn't been on a map in a decade." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My lungs were too busy trying to reclaim the oxygen I'd lost. My knuckles were white where I gripped the railing. I wasn't the beggarly dog walker anymore. I was a liability who knew too much. He stepped closer, the hyper-realistic detail of the grime and sweat on his face visible even in the dim emergency lighting. He reached into his waistband and pulled out his phone, the screen glowing with a bright, harsh light. "Look," he commanded. He held the device in front of my face. It was a live feed from a security camera in a high-security prison block. My breath caught. In the center of the frame was a man with thinning hair and shoulders that slumped under the weight of a decade of silence. "Dad," I whispered, the word slipping out before I could choke it back. "The rivals didn't come for Fenris," Kenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous cinematic whisper. "They came because someone moved your father to a different cell 2 hours ago. Someone who wants him to talk, and they think you're the key to making him do it." Before I could process the image, the phone screen flickered and died. A shadow moved at the top of the stairwell. I looked up, expecting another operative, but the man standing there wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my apartment, and he was holding a detonator. "Kenzo," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "You should have left the girl in the mall." The man pressed the button. The floor beneath our feet didn't just shake, it dissolved. The floor didn't just give way, it turned into a hungry mouth. I remember the sensation of gravity betraying me, the stomach-flipping drop into a void of concrete dust and splintering wood. It was an in medias res descent into a nightmare I thought I had escaped a decade ago. When the world stopped screaming, the silence was worse. It was a thick, heavy thing that pressed against my eardrums. I tried to inhale, but only swallowed a lungful of pulverized stone. My vision was a blurred mess of 8K hyper-realistic grit and flickering orange embers dancing across the ruins of the facility. I coughed, the sound echoing in what felt like a basement tomb. "Kenzo?" I rasped, my voice barely a thread. I shifted, and a white-hot spike of pain shot through my shoulder. I was pinned under a heavy timber, the rough wood snagging on my skin. Beside me, a low, pained whimper broke the stillness. Fenris, the alpha's black coat, was grey with dust, his paws digging frantically at a pile of rubble. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for the king. "Fenris, stay," I whispered, though my own panic was a cold, claw in my throat. I looked to my left. Kenzo was there, half buried under a collapsed section of the stairwell. His face was a mask of dust and blood, but his eyes were open, two sharp, obsidian chips reflecting the fire from a ruptured gas line nearby. He wasn't struggling. He was watching the hole we had just fallen through. His stillness was more terrifying than any scream. A silhouette appeared at the edge of the fracture, 30 feet above us. The man in the expensive suit looked down. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a shareholder at a board meeting. This was the Netflix standard villain, clean, detached, and utterly heartless. "I told you the girl was a mistake, Kenzo." The voice drifted down, smooth and untouched by the chaos. "You always had a weakness for things you thought you could tame." Kenzo's knuckles were white as he gripped a piece of rebar, his chest heaving in shallow, jagged bursts. You were the one who leaked the location 10 years ago. "It wasn't the poachers, it was the board." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the concrete. "The Alpha secret was never meant for one family, Kenzo. It was meant for the highest bidder. And your father was too noble to see the profit in a biological weapon that wears a collar." I felt the blood drain from my face. This man didn't just want the dog. He was the reason my father was in that cell. He was the reason I had spent my life as a beggarly dog walker, living in the cracks of the city. The anger flared in my chest, hotter than the gas fire nearby. My palms were sweating, and my knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the man who had stolen my life. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metallic cylinder, a flare. "End of the line, King. I'll take the girl's father now. He's the only one left who knows the genetic sequence. You and the girl are just overhead." He dropped the flare. It fell like a slow-motion streak of red lightning, bouncing off the rubble toward the leaking gas. "Amara, move!" Kenzo roared, his hand reaching out to shove me toward a crawl space beneath the debris. I didn't move toward safety. I moved toward the flare. I followed the action-first instinct that had kept me alive in the slums. I didn't think about the heat or the weight of the timber on my shoulder. I thought about the man in that prison cell who was waiting for a daughter who might never come. I caught the flare inches from the gas leak, the heat blistering the skin of my palms. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the weight of the choice. "Fenris, go!" I screamed, pointing at the ledge above. The Doberman didn't hesitate. He launched himself up the remains of the staircase, a blur of black fury. The man at the top pulled his weapon, but the beast was faster. However, as the dog reached the ledge, a second explosion rocked the foundation. The ceiling didn't just crack, it began to rain heavy, reinforced concrete blocks in a cinematic cascade of destruction. One block, the size of a tombstone, was heading straight for Kenzo's head. I threw the flare into the darkness and threw myself over him, my eyes wide as the shadow of the falling block engulfed us both. The last thing I saw was the traitor's face turning from triumph to terror as the floor beneath him began to crumble. The ringing in my ears was a high, thin wire of sound that drowned out the world. For a long time, there was only the taste of copper and the smell of pulverized lime. I couldn't feel my legs, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I thought the darkness had become permanent. Then, a ragged, wet cough tore through the silence. Not mine, but his. I shifted, and the agony in my back was a white-hot brand. The concrete block hadn't crushed us, but the rebar within the pillar had caught the edge of the slab, tilting it just enough to create a triangular pocket of survival. I was draped over Kenzo Sato, my weight pressing him into the grit, my arms still locked around his head in a desperate, instinctive shield. "Get off!" he rasped, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. I tried to move, but my muscles were water. My palms were raw from the flare, and the skin of my forearms was peppered with tiny shards of glass that caught the dim, flickering orange light of the gas fire. I rolled to the side, my breath coming in shallow, frantic hitches as my ribs protested the movement. The sub-basement was a graveyard of twisted metal and flooded conduits. A burst water pipe was hissing nearby, the spray turning the dust into a thick, suffocating mud that coated everything. Kenzo sat up slowly, his movements jagged and pained. His custom-tailored suit was a ruin, the silk shredded, revealing the heavy black ink of a dragon tattoo that coiled around his shoulder like a living thing. "Why?" he whispered. He didn't look at the wreckage or the hole where the traitor had disappeared. He looked at my hands, the hands of a beggarly dog walker who had spent her life cleaning up the messes of the elite. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the blisters on my palms before he pulled back as if burned himself. "You should have let it hit me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous cinematic low. "You would have been free. The debt would have died with me." I didn't answer. I couldn't tell him that my body had moved before my mind could calculate the profit of his death. I couldn't tell him that the in medias res instinct of a survivor doesn't allow for logic. My knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the dark pool of blood forming beneath his side. "You're bleeding," I managed to say, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. He looked down at the jagged piece of rebar protruding from his oblique, his expression never flickering. He didn't show the pain, he only showed the calculation. He was the Mafia King, a man who had been groomed to view every wound as a strategic variable. "It missed the kidney," he said, his voice cold. "But the water is rising. If we don't move, we drown in the dark." Beside us, a low, guttural whine echoed through the chamber. Fenris emerged from the shadows, his black coat matted with grey slush. He was limping, but his eyes were fixed on me, not the king. The alpha nudged my hand with his cold nose, his tail giving a single, heavy thump against a piece of debris. Kenzo watched the interaction, his jaw tightening. "He doesn't bow to me anymore. He chose you." I reached out and buried my fingers in the alpha's thick fur, the warmth of the animal, the only thing keeping me from shattering. "He knows I'm the only one who can fix what's broken, Kenzo, just like my father did." The king's eyes narrowed, the 8K hyper-realistic detail of the sweat and blood on his brow illuminated by a sudden spark from a downed electrical line. He reached out and gripped my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. "Your father didn't just fix things, Amara. He changed them. He built a loyalty into this pack that transcends commands. And now, I think I know why they wanted him in that cell." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "They don't want the cure. They want the trigger. And you, the girl from the slums who talks to wolves, are the only one who can pull it." A sudden, heavy thud sounded from the floor above us, then another. It wasn't the sound of falling debris. It was the rhythmic, synchronized pulse of tactical boots. The traitor wasn't finished. Kenzo gripped the rebar in his side, his knuckles turning white as he prepared to pull it out. "If you want to see your father alive, you have to do exactly what I say. No more mercy, no more dog walker lies." He yanked the metal free with a guttural growl, and the lights in the sub-basement died completely. In the absolute black, the only sound was the clicking of Fenris's claws and the heavy metallic slide of a handgun being cocked. The dark wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight pressing into my eyes until white sparks danced in the void. I could hear Kenzo's breathing, ragged, shallow, and wet. The metallic slide of his handgun being cocked was the only anchor in the abyss. "Give me your hand," I whispered, my voice barely a vibration in the humid air. I didn't wait for his permission. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, expensive silk of his sleeve before finding his palm. It was slick with blood, but his grip was a sudden, bone-crushing vice. He was the king of the north, a man who ruled with a glance, but here in the belly of the earth, he was just a wounded animal. "You don't know the way," he rasped, his breath hot against my ear. "I grew up in the ventilation shafts of this building while my father worked upstairs." I countered, my in medias res instinct overriding the fear that tried to paralyze my legs. "I know where the pipes don't lead to dead ends." I moved. I didn't walk. I flowed through the wreckage. My feet found the gaps in the debris with a movie-in-the-mind precision, sensing the air currents that signaled open space. Behind me, Kenzo stumbled, a muffled grunt of pain escaping his lips as the rebar wound in his side protested every step. Above us, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of tactical boots grew louder. They were using thermal scanners. "Fenris, heal," I breathed. The alpha's fur brushed against my thigh, a warm, bristling comfort in the freezing dark. He was our radar. When his head tilted to the left, I pulled Kenzo to the right. We were a single, three-headed creature navigating a labyrinth of shattered dreams. We reached a narrow junction where the ceiling had bowed low, forcing us into a crawl. The smell of old copper and stagnant water was overwhelming. I dropped to my knees, the grit biting into my skin, and pulled Kenzo down with me. "Stay close," I said, the fast lane pace of our escape leaving no room for small talk. We crawled through a pipe that felt like a throat, the rusted metal scraping against Kenzo's broad shoulders. I could hear his teeth grinding, a sound of pure, stubborn will. He wasn't just a Mafia King. He was a man who refused to die in a hole. Suddenly, a beam of harsh artificial light cut through the dark behind us. "Found them! Basement Sector 4!" A voice boomed, distorted by a respirator. The action-first start of the hunt was over. The kill was beginning. "Go!" Kenzo commanded, shoving me forward. "Don't look back." I didn't listen. I turned, my palms sweating and my knees shaking, as I stared at the light rapidly approaching the end of the tunnel. I saw the silhouette of a soldier, the barrel of a rifle emerging into our sanctuary. Fenris didn't wait for a command. He launched backward through the pipe, a blur of black muscle. There was a scream, a spray of hot liquid that hit the metal walls with a sickening pat, 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 and then a heavy silence. I hauled Kenzo through the final few feet of the pipe and into a small, hidden maintenance room. The air here was different, stale but dry. I fumbled for a wall switch I remembered from a lifetime ago. The light flickered on, a dim yellow bulb that cast long skeletal shadows. Kenzo slumped against a row of filing cabinets, his face ashen, his hand pressed firmly against the dark stain on his side. He looked up, his eyes widening as he took in the room. This wasn't a maintenance closet. The walls were covered in Netflix-standard cinematic maps, DNA sequences, and photos of Kenzo, taken from the shadows over the last 10 years. In the center of the room was a single well-lit desk with a letter addressed to me. My father didn't just hide a secret in the dog, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. He hid it in me. Kenzo reached for the letter, but as his fingers touched the paper, the monitors on the wall sparked to life. A face appeared, the face of the man who had supposedly died in the explosion above. "Hello, Amara," the traitor said, his voice smooth and untouched. "I hope you like the inheritance your father left you. It's time to open the final loop." The room began to hum with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. Fenris began to howl, not a bark of warning, but a sound of pure, agonized recognition. The hum wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical invasion that vibrated the marrow of my bones. It felt like 1,000 needles pricking the inside of my skull, a low-frequency pulse that turned the air in the maintenance room into a thick, electric soup. Fenris wasn't just howling. His body was rigid, his paws locked to the concrete as his eyes shifted from molten amber to a glowing, unnatural white that mirrored the flickering monitors on the wall. "Amara, stop it!" Kenzo's voice was a ragged shout, but it sounded miles away. He was slumped against the filing cabinets, his hand clutching the open wound in his side, his face a mask of 8K hyper-realistic agony. He reached for his weapon, but his fingers were clumsy, trembling with the same vibration that was shaking the foundation of the building. For the first time, the King of the North looked small, a mere mortal caught in a storm he couldn't control. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My hand was flat against the desk, and the wood felt warm. No, it felt alive. The letter in front of me began to glow as the ink reacted to the frequency. I didn't need to read the words to know what they said. I could feel them. My father hadn't just studied DNA. He had mapped the connection between the human voice and the predatory instinct. He had built a biological bridge, and I was the only one who knew the architecture. "The Alpha isn't a weapon, Kenzo," I whispered, my voice sounding amplified, vibrating with the same resonance as the room. "He's a mirror." Kenzo forced himself upright, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he leveled his gun at the monitor. "Shut it down, Amara. If that frequency reaches the city's grid, every dog in his pack will turn." "They won't turn," I said, the action-first instinct of a creator taking over. "They'll awaken." The traitor's face on the screen twisted into a grotesque grin. "Exactly, my dear. Awaken to the call of their true master. Now, transmit the sequence. Do it, or your father dies in that cell before the next pulse." My palms were sweating, and my knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the glowing sequence on the desk. The power switch was absolute. I held the life of the Mafia King in one hand and the soul of my father in the other. Kenzo moved, his barrel shifting from the screen to me. "I won't let you do it," he rasped, his eyes filled with a desperate cinematic conflict. "I'll kill you before I let the board have that power." "Then do it," I challenged, stepping away from the desk. The hum reached a crescendo, a sound like a choir of wolves singing in the dark. Fenris suddenly turned. He didn't growl at the door or the monitor. He turned his glowing white eyes on Kenzo. The Alpha, the beast that had been the symbol of the Sato bloodline for generations, took a slow, menacing step toward his king. Kenzo froze. The authority he had carried since birth was gone. stripped away by a frequency he couldn't hear. He was no longer the master, he was the prey. "Fenris, back!" Kenzo commanded, his voice cracking. The dog didn't move. He showed his teeth, white, bone-crushing blades, and let out a vibration that made the metal floor ripple. "He doesn't listen to the king anymore," I said, moving to stand between them. I reached out and placed my blistered palm on the alpha's forehead. The glow in his eyes softened, but didn't fade. "He only listens to the frequency." The hierarchy had shifted in a single heartbeat. I wasn't the beggarly dog walker or the lost dog anymore. I was the sovereign. Kenzo lowered his weapon, his chest heaving as he realized the woman he had tried to protect was now the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. A heavy explosion rocked the door of the maintenance room. The steel warped, the hinges screaming as the board's final tactical team began their breach. "The sequence, Amara!" the traitor screamed from the monitor. "Now!" I looked at the desk, then at Kenzo, whose blood was pooling on the floor. "If I sent the sequence, my father lived, but the world burned. If I didn't, we died here in the dark." I reached for the microphone on the desk, my fingers hovering over the transmit button. Fenris let out a low, expectant whimper. "Dad," I whispered, "forgive me." I didn't hit the button. I grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the desk and smashed the monitor into 1,000 jagged pieces of glass. The hum died instantly, plunged into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The door to the room blew off its hinges. As the tactical team rushed in, their muzzles flashing in the dark, I didn't hide. I stood over the wounded king and the alpha beast, my voice a blade of pure cinematic defiance. "Fenris, hunt!" The air in the maintenance room didn't just vibrate. It ignited. The steel door didn't fall. It disintegrated in a Netflix-standard bloom of orange flame and white magnesium light. The action-first start was a wall of heat that threw me backward, my ears ringing with a sound like 1,000 freight trains. Through the 8K, hyper-realistic haze of dust and cordite, I saw Fenris. The Doberman wasn't a dog anymore. He was a silent, black ink shadow moving against a background of fire. He didn't bark. He didn't warn. He launched into the throat of the first tactical operative before the man's boots even cleared the threshold. There was a sickening crunch, a spray of dark liquid against the bright, well-lit wall, and then the alpha was already onto the second target. I scrambled toward Kenzo. The Mafia King was slumped against the cabinets, his hands slick with a dark, cinematic red as he tried to chamber around into his sidearm. His face was a mask of cold, stubborn will, but his eyes were glazing over. "Amara, get out!" he choked out, the words barely audible over the chatter of submachine guns. I didn't listen. I grabbed a heavy, rusted fire extinguisher from the wall, my movie-in-the-mind weapon, and swung with everything I had. The metal canister connected with the helmet of a soldier stepping over Fenris, the impact vibrating up my arms and into my teeth. The man went down like a sack of stones. "I'm not leaving the only person who knows where my father is," I screamed. Suddenly, the gunfire stopped. It wasn't a ceasefire. It was a command. The tactical team parted, their muzzles lowering in a synchronized display of discipline. From the smoking ruins of the doorway, a figure stepped through. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing the same suit I'd seen him in 1,000 times at the Sato estate. It was Yuan Bao, Kenzo's right hand, the man who had been the ice-cold shield for the bloodline for 20 years. Kenzo's head lolled back against the filing cabinet, a bitter, pained laugh escaping his lips. "Yuan Bao, I thought the poachers got you." Yuan Bao stepped into the well-lit center of the room, his expression as calm as a summer pond. He looked at the blood on his hands, Kenzo's blood, and didn't even flinch. "The poachers were a distraction, Kenzo. Just like the girl, just like the alpha." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the Netflix standard villain behind the loyal mask. "Your father didn't hide the secret in the dog's DNA, Amara. He hid it in the frequency of his own voice. And since he won't talk, I've decided to use the only thing he values more than his research." Yuan Bao reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside was a swirling, iridescent blue liquid, the raw neurotoxin I had seen in my father's notes. "The board doesn't want the alpha to bow to a king," Yuan Bao said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They want the alpha to kill the king. And they want the girl to watch." He dropped the vial. It shattered on the concrete, the blue mist rising like a ghost. Fenris, who had been standing over me, suddenly stiffened. His glowing white eyes turned a violent, jagged crimson. He didn't look at the soldiers. He didn't look at Yuan Bao. He turned his bone-crushing jaws toward Kenzo's throat. "Fenris, no!" I lunged forward, but Yuan Bao caught my throat in a grip of iron, pinning me to the bright, well-lit wall. "Watch, Amara," he hissed. "Watch the mercy you fought for become the weapon that ends the Sato Empire." The alpha lunged. The blue mist wasn't just a gas. It was a physical weight, a suffocating curtain that smelled of ozone and artificial decay. Fenris's claws screeched against the concrete, the sound like a nail on a chalkboard as his massive frame bunched for the kill. His red eyes were fixed on Kenzo's exposed throat, his heavy muscles rippling under a coat grey with dust. Yuanbao's hand was a vice around my neck, pinning me to the bright and well-lit wall, while the maintenance room hummed with a low-frequency pulse that turned my teeth into tuning forks. "Do it, beast!" Yuanbao hissed. His breath was hot and smelled of mint, a sickeningly clean scent for a man about to commit regicide. He leaned in closer, his Netflix standard villain face a mask of detached corporate cruelty. "Watch the mercy you fought for become the weapon that ends the Sato Empire." I didn't reach for a weapon. My palms were raw, the blisters from the flare weeping against the grit of the sub-basement. I reached for my voice. My father hadn't just built a machine. He had built a resonant anchor in the woman who shared his blood. I didn't scream for help. I used the action-first start of my own reign. "Fenris, submission!" The sound didn't come from my throat. It felt like it ripped from the air itself. It was a jagged, cinematic frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the brainstem. The red in the alpha's eyes didn't fade. It shattered. The beast skidded, his paws digging into the concrete as he twisted his frame mid-air. He didn't hit Kenzo. He slammed into Yuanbao, the ice-cold shield who had turned into a Judas. Yuanbao didn't have time to draw his weapon. The alpha's teeth caught the fine silk of his shoulder, the bone-crushing jaws locking with a wet thud. The traitor hit the floor, and I followed, the 8K hyper-realistic dust clouds rising to choke me. I scrambled away, my breath coming in shallow, frantic hitches as I crawled toward the man I had saved. Beside the filing cabinets, Kenzo was a shadow of the man I'd met at the mall. His face was ash, his hand clutching the dark cinematic stain on his side where the rebar had carved its name. But as I reached him, his eyes weren't on the traitor. They were on me, the beggarly dog walker, who was now vibrating with the power of 1,000 wolves. "The trigger!" Kenzo wheezed, his fingers catching my wrist. His grip was weak, a shadow of the vice-like hold he'd had in the pipe, but his gaze was as sharp as a diamond. "He's still alive, Amara? Your father? The monitor?" I looked at the screen. It was cracked, the Netflix standard image of my father in his cell, flickering in and out of existence like a ghost. The board's tactical teams were closing in, their muzzles flashing in the dark corridors of the prison block. The room was a tomb of high-stakes conflict and emotional debt. "Open the grid," Yuanbao choked out from under the dog's weight, his expensive suit now a shredded ruin of blood and dust. "If you don't transmit the activation code, they'll kill him. The board doesn't leave loose ends, Amara. You're just overhead." My palms were sweating, and my knees wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the final power switch. The length logic of my father's secret was simple. Control the frequency, control the pack. If I opened the grid, the frequency would spread through the city's towers. Every alpha in the north would awaken, and the underworld would be mine to lead. My father would walk free, but the city, the only home I had, would become a biological war zone. I looked at Fenris. The beast was watching me, his eyes now a steady, glowing amber. He was waiting for the narrative storytelling conclusion of his legacy. Then I looked at Kenzo. He didn't ask me to save him. He didn't ask me to save his crown. He only nodded, his show don't tell silence, giving me the permission to be the leader the city needed. I reached for the microphone. I didn't transmit the sequence. I transmitted a single command, layered in the frequency my father had whispered to me in the dark before the facility burned. "Pack! Protect!" Outside, in the bright and well-lit streets of the north, the silence was broken. Thousands of ears perked up in the luxury high-rises and the back alleys. The board's tactical teams, standing over my father's cell, suddenly realized they weren't the predators. The monitor flickered one last time. I saw my father stand. I saw him walk toward the bars, as they were torn off their hinges by the very beasts that were supposed to be his jailers. The cliffhanger energy of 10 years of waiting was over in a single pulse. Kenzo's hand went slack in mine. I pulled him close, his head resting against my shoulder, as the first rays of a new sun hit the ruins of the sub-basement through the shattered floor. We weren't a king and a beggar anymore. We were the start of something the city couldn't name. The Melanin and the Mafia's pack had just inherited the earth. As the smoke cleared, I realized this wasn't an ending. My father was free, but the board was still out there, and the city now knew there was a new queen in the north, and she had a pack that didn't know how to bow. If you believe this girl, who chose loyalty over a crown and saved her father from the jaws of death, deserves to see her own reign begin, hit the like button and subscribe so her story is never forgotten.